Hi, my name is Yi-Bin Chen. I direct the bone marrow transplant program at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. And today I'll be discussing implications and findings from a recent abstract I presented at the 2023 Tandem meetings concerning the use of vedolizumab for the prevention of lower GI acute graft-versus-host disease. These were the results of the GRAPHITE study, which was a phase 3 international randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled multi-center study that myself and colleagues have been working on for several years. Just as a bit of background, I think all of us know that lower GI GvHD is probably the biggest early complication that leads to patient morbidity and mortality after allogeneic transplantation. And while some view acute graft-versus-host disease as one disease, because it is systemic inflammation driven, we think, by a Th1 donor T cell response against recipient tissue, I think we can all acknowledge that lower GI acute GvHD is the main organ, and if we were able to prevent that better, then results could be improved. I've had an interest in using vedolizumab for now over 20 years for acute graft-versus-host disease. Certainly, colleagues have had the same interest even into the 90s in terms of inhibition or modulation of lymphocyte trafficking to help improve outcomes after transplantation. Vedolizumab is a monoclonal antibody that targets the alpha-4 beta-7 integrin, which is a gut-homing molecule present on the surface of lymphocytes. Vedolizumab is approved for the treatment of advanced inflammatory bowel disease. And we had previously published a phase 1b experience using vedolizumab in conjunction with standard tacrolimus and methotrexate for GvHD prophylaxis. This has been published a couple of years ago in Blood Advances, showing safety with using vedolizumab during this time period with no effects on engraftment or recovery kinetics of counts. And there's a compellingly low incidence of lower GI GvHD, and that's what formed the basis to do this phase 3 randomized international study. There have also been several anecdotes and case series in the literature published of using vedolizumab for the treatment of refractory GI acute graft-versus-host disease with mixed results, and it remains a part of our armamentarium, and it is one of our standards at Mass General to be used, usually in combination with ruxolitinib. So this study was a phase 3 study that aimed to enroll 558 patients, powered for a primary endpoint of lower GI GvHD free survival. There was an assumption that we could reduce the event rate there from 34% in the placebo arm to about 22% in patients who received vedolizumab. So patients were randomized 1-to-1 to either placebo or vedolizumab. All patients received unrelated donor grafts and could receive any intensity of conditioning. Patients could receive ATG, and they had to receive some sort of standard calcineurin inhibitor-based GvHD prevention platform. Vedolizumab was given first on the day before transplant and for 6 doses afterwards to provide coverage in the first 6 months, which is when we think most of the incidence of lower GI GvHD occurs. Patients were enrolled at 94 centers all throughout the world. Unfortunately, the study was closed after enrolling 343 patients in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic due to issues with enrollment and accrual during that time. So only about 333 patients proceeded to transplant on study, and those were the results that I had the pleasure of presenting. When we looked and analyzed the data, these patients are very relevant to the modern population. Over 90% of patients received a peripheral blood stem cell graft. Over 90% were HLA fully matched. And about half of patients had myeloablative conditioning and the other half with reduced intensity. And 40% of patients received some sort of ATG product in addition to their standard prophylaxis. So really a modern population of transplant. The diseases were what you'd expect, dominated by myeloid diseases, which are the patients that we treat these days. The primary endpoint, again, was this endpoint of lower GI GvHD-free survival by day 180. So the events there were the development of lower GI GvHD of any stage or death from any cause. And when analyzed, even with only 60% of projected enrollment, The vedolizumab arm had an 85.5% event-free survival, whereas those in the placebo group were 70.9%. So a hazard ratio of 0.45, which was highly statistically significant. When we dove into that primary endpoint to look at the events that drove the difference, while the death rate was comparable between the two arms at 9.7% and 7.1%, really what drove the big difference here was the reduction in lower GI-GvHD observed in patients who received vedolizumab. And when we looked at the stages of GI-GvHD, the main sort of driver were stages 2 through 4 disease, which, as we all know, is overall grade 3 through 4. And those are the cases that we worry about the most and have to readmit the most after transplant and cause the most morbidity and mortality. When we looked at sort of subgroup analyses, we broke down sort of by conditioning regimen intensity, with or without ATG, tacrolimus versus cyclosporin, or HLA fully matched versus mismatched. All of the subgroups leaned in the way towards benefit of receiving vedolizumab, which is really nice to see, and really validated the results that we observed in this study. In terms of other endpoints in the study that we saw, certainly the two first key secondary endpoints were very statistically significant as well. The first was lower GI-GvHD and relapse-free survival by 6 months, and the second was overall any organ grade C through D GvHD-free survival, and both of those showed a strong benefit towards receiving vedolizumab. In terms of safety, which is really important because we're giving vedolizumab during the sensitive time of transplantation, the overall number of adverse events or adverse events attributable to drug versus placebo were pretty comparable across the board. There were no significant safety signals that stood out in this large phase 3 study that we didn't see in our earlier phase 1b. There were a few more infections in the vedolizumab arm. Those appeared to be upper respiratory tract infections, which is also seen in the inflammatory bowel disease population, so very consistent with the use of this drug. And there are a few more cases of C. diff colitis or C. diff enteritis, and that is another signal that's also seen in the IBD population. So, this is a large phase 3 study. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that we could not finish accrual of the planned 558 patients, but we did enroll 343 patients, and 333 were analyzed as those were the patients that received a dose of drug and actually underwent transplantation. That's still, in our field of transplant and GvHD prevention, a very large study. The randomization was done well with stratification for key variables such as use of ATG, conditioning regimen intensity, and HLA match. And the results sort of speak for themselves. Clearly the study was, you do these study calculations to design a study, and you do your best guess as to the effect size. And even with 60% of the projected accrual, we were able to see a highly statistically significant benefit for the use of vedolizumab. And clearly, the benefit was driven all by lower GI-GvHD. One wonders if we had enrolled the full study, would we have seen benefits in either non-relapse mortality or overall survival, both of which had numerical advantages for vedolizumab, but were not statistically significant. But I guess we'll never know that. This would be, and it is, the first phase 3 study for specific prevention of lower GI-GvHD. It's, as we move forward in graft-versus-host disease, both in prevention and treatment, I think we're starting to break away from the historical use of accumulative systemic immunosuppression, which has its downsides for obvious reasons, and targeting more specific inflammatory pathways, or focusing on organ resiliency, or focusing on something like lymphocyte trafficking, which inherently will then make this an organ-specific benefit if it works. And I think the field should be proud that we were able to complete this study and show this benefit. I do hope that the regulatory agencies view this the same way. I do honestly believe that vedolizumab would be a benefit for patients undergoing transplantation. We'll acknowledge there's more data to glean from this trial, such as sort of what's the difference in the maximal stage of acute GvHD between the two arms, and the impact on chronic graft-versus-host disease as well. Lastly, I'll just say that, the field of GvHD prevention is a changing landscape, and that only speaks to the progress that all of us have made. In the US, we had our first approval of abatacept for GvHD prevention recently, and there have been pivotal trials concerning the use of post-transplant cyclophosphamide, which we're all using more and increasingly in different donor types and platforms. Certainly, with this changing landscape and a moving standard of care, any results have to be interpreted through that lens. And combining vedolizumab with these newer agents should be something we do in the future. But with our success, the number of events of serious graft-versus-host disease, be it in this trial with vedolizumab or with abatacept or with post-transplant cyclophosphamide, it is clear that as we make progress, the number of events of serious acute GvHD is decreasing, and that's a good thing. However, as we look forward, it also makes designing and conducting clinical trials to improve upon that standard of care even more difficult. With a decreasing number of events, prospective large trials will be even larger. And with fewer events, there's much uncertainty over how we will prove benefit. And I think that's something that we need to discuss as a field on a national and an international level of what the ideal primary endpoint should be going forward. In the past, we had just said incidence of acute graft-versus-host disease. When we realized that wasn't perfect for several reasons, including competing risks of disease relapse, we created composite endpoints that encompass survival, disease relapse, graft-versus-host disease, and so forth. Those, while allowing us to conduct large trials, have their own issues. Certainly weighting of those outcomes is equal for those composite endpoints and probably not equal from a patient experience. And then as we improve in the treatment of acute or chronic graft-versus-host disease, perhaps that emphasizes the fact that we cannot weight those things equally. We cannot weight acute graft-versus-host disease and death as equal outcomes, and thus making those composite endpoints probably not legitimate for trials going forward. So I think these are just discussions we need to have to move the field forward. But that all being said, it's great that we've made the progress, and it's good for us, it's good for our patients, and the research has to continue going forward. I hope we're able to use vedolizumab for lower GI GvHD prevention, and I hope we're able to study it more going forward. Thank you very much.